I think the role of the Foreign Service is to support the president in pursuing diplomacy, which is to say to promote American interests and values by means short of war. I think the Foreign Service, the value added of all of us as career diplomats is an understanding of foreign societies and how best to navigate foreign landscapes in the pursuit of American interests and values. And so when we're doing our job at our best, that's what we provide. Sure, well, certainly the world has changed significantly since that time. I entered the Foreign Service in the early 1980s at the height of the Cold War. When you look at the turbulence of the world today, it almost makes you nostalgic for what seems to be the clarity of the Cold War world. The truth is it was anything but clear, and it had its share of challenges and uncertainties as well. But the Foreign Service has changed, I think, in a lot of very important ways, just as the world has. First, when I came into the Foreign Service, diplomacy, I think, was seen typically as a connection between governments, and the role of diplomats was to connect our government to a foreign government. Today, and this is something President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Kerry have put special emphasis on, the role of American diplomats is only partly about connecting to governments. It's also about helping our society to connect to other societies as well. And so that requires a kind of outreach that goes beyond traipsing back and forth to foreign ministries. Oh, I think it'll leave us blind in many respects to, how best to navigate foreign societies. I mean, the truth is there's a lot of questioning about the role of professional diplomacy in an age where the information technology revolution has both accelerated the pace of information and expanded the volume enormously. And so the question is, well, why, when you can connect with a foreign minister by video hookup, do you need an embassy and diplomats? Why, when you can go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for development assistance, do you need development professionals? I think the truth is that even in an era where there are lots of different means of communication, social media and others, there's still no substitute at the end for human interaction. Edward R. Murrow, famous CBS newscaster who later became head of the U.S. Information Agency, I think once put it very well, and this goes back almost half a century ago, but when he told young USIA officers that the critical link in the international communications chain is still the last 3 feet, one human being talking to another. And I think that's where the role of the very best American diplomats becomes crucial for the United States and our interests and our values, even as so many other things have changed around us. Well, first, Secretary Kerry is a wonderful man. I have great respect for him, but that's a huge exaggeration. I mean, Kennan was a remarkable diplomat and really a remarkable thinker about American foreign policy. And, what he was able to do at a truly transformative moment in the world and in American foreign policy after the end of the Second World War was to think through and conceptualize how best to deal with the challenge then posed by the Soviet Union. And he was able to express it in the famous long telegram, in a way that captured people's imagination and came at exactly the right moment. And so he helped, I think, more than any other American career diplomat that I know, to shape a strategy for a whole era in American foreign policy. He had many other talents and attributes. He was a wonderful writer, which I still think is important for Foreign Service officers. But that's where he made a remarkable difference. Well, I think Richard Holbrooke is someone I have great admiration for. I think he epitomized a diplomat who's not content just to admire problems. He was always an activist and always someone who would identify solutions and then do something about it, who was always trying to answer the so what question. So what does it mean for the United States, and what can American leadership, American diplomatic leadership do to make a real difference? And I think you saw his force of personality, his intellect in the Balkans in the run-up to the Dayton Accords too. Had it not, there were lots of people who deserve credit for that. Americans as well as many of our other partners and leaders who demonstrated considerable courage in the region itself. But I think Richard Holbrooke deserves enormous credit for making that possible, and his force of personality and his sheer willpower, I think, is something that every American diplomat ought to pay attention to and learn from. Well, there's no such thing, just as you said, as zero risk in the conduct of diplomacy overseas. We have to do everything that we can to protect our people overseas and to manage and mitigate risk as best we can. But there's never going to be a situation in which we can eliminate it entirely. We can't do our jobs if we're holed up behind embassy walls. We have to be able to engage, as I said, not just with governments, but with foreign societies and with people, even in circumstances that carry with them a great deal of risk. Chris Stevens is someone I admired enormously. His death was a tragedy. We learned a lot from that in terms of, ways in which we needed to improve our approaches to security. But I think Chris also embodied the very best in American diplomacy, that curiosity, that ability to connect with foreign societies and to empathize with the challenges that foreigners, in this case Libyans, faced, but always to be clear-eyed about what mattered to the United States and to understand that what he was about was promoting American interests and values. Well, Robert, the example that you cited of Robert visiting an area that, in which the Syrian regime had just reacted very harshly against peaceful protesters was exactly what the very best American diplomats should do, which is to demonstrate our concern about a situation in which some very important values and interests were at stake. Robert showed a lot of personal courage in doing that, physical courage as well, because there was a fair amount of risk involved. But he acted in the very best tradition of American diplomacy. Well, Tex is someone I admire a great deal. Never worked directly with him during the course of our careers, but I think he demonstrated both in his professional experience and in things he's spoken out about since then, the importance of speaking truth to power. And I think it's very important for the integrity of the Foreign Service to be able to be disciplined, because it is not our business to offer public disagreements once decisions are made. But privately, within the system, to be able to offer our very best judgments, even when they're inconvenient to people who are making decisions. And I think Tex embodied that during the course of his career. And I think, a number of individuals over time have followed in that tradition. And it's extremely important to preserve that tradition of constructive dissent. I think, the importance of active diplomatic leadership and engagement overseas in terms of promoting American prosperity has only increased during the course of the 33 years that I've been an American diplomat. The reality is that 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. And so for the United States, more than at any other moment in our history, creating good jobs and encouraging economic growth at home depend on being able to connect overseas, being able to trade. And diplomats play an important role in everything from trying to ensure a level playing field for American companies and trying to work out between governments trade arrangements which are going to promote openness and opportunity for American businesses, to work with foreign companies to encourage them to invest in the United States, to encourage the kind of exchanges and interchange with younger generations overseas that are going to encourage an understanding of the United States and our economy, and that helps lay the foundation for increased trade and investment in the future. So one of the things that Hillary Clinton very strongly emphasized, and John Kerry has as well, is the importance of economic statecraft or commercial diplomacy. It's one of the things I enjoyed most when I served overseas, especially as an ambassador, because you can make a real difference, I think, not just for the biggest American companies, but especially for small and medium-sized enterprises who don't have the resources sometimes to navigate overseas in the way that the biggest American companies do. So, there again, it's a place that American diplomats can make a real difference. Sure. I mean, with the biggest companies, was when I was ambassador in Russia, Boeing was very active in developing the 787, the Dreamliner, and they, worked a number of arrangements with Russian partners, which, helped in the production of that kind of aircraft globally, but also contributed to a number of important sales from Boeing to various Russian purchasers. And in other places around the world, I've had similar experiences when I was ambassador to Jordan. This was in the wake of the transition from King Hussein, who died after more than 45 years on the throne, making the transition to his son, King Abdullah. It's an important moment for the United States to demonstrate our support for Jordanians and for Jordan. And we negotiated a free trade agreement between the United States and Jordan, which at that time was, this is about 15 years ago, was only the fourth such bilateral free trade agreement that we had done any place in the world. That made a significant difference, I think, certainly in economic terms, but also in psychological and political terms, as a demonstration of American commitment to Jordan, to our friend, at a very important and critical moment in its own history. And so, as ambassador, I was very proud to be able to work with my colleagues from the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and from across the U.S. government to help accomplish that. Well, I think in terms of commercial diplomacy, we need to do a better job of working with American businesses to highlight, some of the practical success stories that have occurred. We need to be better advocates, I think, for what we do overseas in support of American business. And I think that'll come with time, because nothing speaks to the value of that kind of role more than tangible success stories. Well, in terms of supporting presidents, any presidential visit overseas is a huge undertaking. And so, I've been in embassies when presidents have visited, and it's a great opportunity. You rarely have that kind of an opportunity to deepen a relationship or build a personal rapport between leaders as you do in that circumstance. But, the embassy, literally every person in an embassy is fully engaged in the support of that kind of a visit, from people who are arranging for aircraft landings and the movement of people and equipment, to people who are taking notes in meetings, or to an ambassador who's helping to ensure that a visit, a meeting, a summit are very well prepared. So it's a great opportunity, but it's also an enormous undertaking. Well, it's a limited constituency, and there's a lot of, compared to the U.S. military, for example, where you have, whether it's bases or, construction or, the production of weaponry, in different places around the United States, jobs that are created as a result of that. It's a natural constituency for members of Congress and for, the American body politic in general. There's a lot of misunderstanding as well, I think, about, the percentage of the federal budget that goes to support for the Foreign Service and for development assistance overseas. In, poll after poll, you ask most Americans what percentage goes to foreign assistance and to the State Department, they'll say 20%, 25%. The reality, as you know, is it's about 1% of the federal budget. I think it's money well spent. It's our responsibility as career diplomats and career development professionals to demonstrate that we're making the best use of that money. And there are ways in which we can streamline our operations as well, which is very important, and to be always on the lookout for waste and mismanagement and ways in which we can improve. But I think it's our responsibility, whether it's with members of Congress or it's when people return to their hometowns around the United States, to tell the story of American diplomacy and to put a human face behind what is an abstraction, diplomacy. And that's not impossible to do, and there's been a much heavier emphasis on doing that over the last few years. Well, in the case of the United States and Iran and the nuclear negotiations, we faced a particular challenge in that we'd had 35 years without sustained direct diplomatic contact. And so, the way in which we broke through that was over the course of 2013, we engaged over most of that year in what were then secret bilateral negotiations with the Iranians, which took place in Oman, as has been publicly reported, and in some locations in Europe as well as in New York. I think it was important to be able to do that discreetly because of the baggage on both sides, because of the absence of a habit of direct communication. We had to kind of build that up over time and begin to develop a kind of professional rapport. The small team of people that I was a part of and that I led during that time, dealt with a couple of the Iranian deputy foreign ministers throughout most of that period, who were good, tough, smart negotiators, doing everything they can to, promote Iran's interests and its point of view in these negotiations, and I developed a fair amount of professional respect for them. And through the course of about a dozen sessions in 2013, we helped prepare the groundwork for what became the Joint Plan of Action, the first agreement that was reached on the nuclear issue, which for the first time in more than a decade actually froze the Iranian nuclear program, rolled it back in some significant respects in return for relatively modest sanctions relief, while preserving the major elements of the sanctions architecture, preserving the international support for the sanctions architecture, and preparing the way, creating a foundation on which we could embark on negotiations for a comprehensive agreement. All of that is easier said than done, but I think breaking through that history of 35 years without direct bilateral contact was an important and essential step. And I think we were able to help reach a first agreement that was in many respects historic, and that helped create at least the possibility of a more wide-reaching comprehensive settlement. Well, I think the result of that, horrible episode, and the result of, Iranian behavior that was inexcusable by, any measure. The result of that, of course, was the suffering that a lot of, my colleagues had to go through, as well as through their families, and it left a very bitter legacy, I think, on certainly on the American side, and contributed to what were then more than 3 decades of estrangement, as well as an absence of direct communication. And so it's hard for people to forget circumstances like that. They should never forget it. But we've been able at least to restore direct communication with the participation of really admirable American diplomats like John Limbert, who worked with me in the early phases as we were trying to prepare the ground for what later became the bilateral contacts in 2013. Sure. I think the hostage crisis had a huge impact on the Foreign Service. I remember I was in graduate school at the time, because I came into the Foreign Service 2 or 3 years later. I remember having great admiration and respect for what my colleagues had gone through. It underscored the sacrifice that diplomats sometimes are required to make. It underscored what was at stake in the Middle East in a period of huge turbulence. We always think that the period in which we're working now is the most turbulent period ever. As you look backwards, 35 years, that was quite a turbulent period itself. But it underscored the significance of what American diplomats can do in helping to understand, what's at stake in that kind of turbulence and how best to navigate it. I think there are a number of challenges. First, I think, is, we're about people, and, the quality of the Foreign Service is really about the quality of the people that we bring in and that we retain and train over time. I'm deeply impressed by the quality of young officers coming into the Foreign Service now. When I was Deputy Secretary, I'd speak to each of the entering classes, and I'm glad in many respects I didn't have to compete with them when I came into the Foreign Service, because in terms of their experience, their language ability, their drive, and their commitment, they're really exemplary, I think. It's a more diverse group than it was when I came into the Foreign Service, and I think that's extremely important, not only to maintain but to strengthen, because we still have a long way to go in terms of ensuring that we have a Foreign Service that looks like American society. I've always believed that the power of our example overseas is more important than the power of our preaching, and if we want to get an audience overseas for pluralism and the significance of the rule of law and for tolerance and diversity, it helps a lot when our Foreign Service, the Americans that people in other societies see every day, embodies those kind of virtues. So that's important. Second, we have to ensure that our diplomats have the resources and the tools that they need. Not just budget resources, but the time and attention that's required to ensure that people have foreign language skills, because that's an essential element of an effective diplomacy overseas. Managing risk is another very important challenge, as we look over the next couple of decades. We're never going to eliminate physical and security risk overseas. We have to manage it as best we can, protect our people as best we can, but we have to learn to cope with those kind of risks over time. And finally, I think for the Foreign Service, like any other institution, we have to stay ahead of the curve. And we have to be able to anticipate challenges that are on the horizon and that, the United States is going to have to deal with overseas. Throughout much of my career, my colleagues and I focused on issues like energy security and nuclear nonproliferation, especially at the height of the Cold War. Those issues are still very important. But now we've got to focus on a range of other issues in addition to that: economic statecraft, the promotion of American businesses overseas, gender issues, human rights issues, which have always been important in American foreign policy, but I think are increasingly a part of our job overseas, support for civil society groups, and issues that cut across national boundaries, whether it's issues of climate change or global health challenges, water and food insecurity. So it's very important for the Foreign Service not to be a static body, but to be, developing the habit of looking over the horizon. We're still very, very fortunate in being able to attract, I think, the best people of their generation in American society into the Foreign Service. And a large part of that is because I honestly do believe that career American diplomacy, offers Americans an opportunity to live a life of significance in the pursuit of American interests and values overseas. It may sound a little trite to say, but it really is an opportunity to make a difference and to help make the world step by step and sometimes inch by inch a little bit better place. So that attracts the very best, I think, in generations of Americans. But retaining those people is going to be a challenge. I think it's especially true for the generation of Foreign Service officers that came in and experienced, hugely difficult circumstances in war zones, whether in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in other very difficult places around the world, whether it's Yemen or in other kinds of situations. They've early on in their careers had a great deal of responsibility and a great deal of opportunity. So it's important for the Foreign Service to focus on the importance of continuing to challenge officers and demonstrating that their work is appreciated, because that's going to be the key to retaining those exceptionally capable people who come into the Foreign Service. I think one of the kind of perverse consequences of WikiLeaks was to demonstrate that, career American diplomats actually do understand how to navigate foreign societies. They do understand the dynamics of foreign societies. They're pretty honest about offering their analysis and their judgments to Washington, whether it's about problems of corruption overseas or how personalities interact. It's deeply unfortunate, and I think it was quite damaging to have all that revealed, because it makes it harder, I think, for foreign counterparts to want to have candid conversations. But as I said, I think one of the perverse consequences maybe was to demonstrate that career American diplomats can be pretty good at their job sometimes and are quite honest and straightforward about their analysis of other societies. I don't know whether it's harder. It was challenged in much different periods, different circumstances overseas. There was a clarity about the Cold War, at least in hindsight, that I think can seem to make the terrain a little easier to navigate. But the truth is, there were different kinds of challenges in both eras. 33 years ago when I came in, and when I left the Foreign Service a couple of months ago. And I think the core qualities of the best American diplomats are as relevant today as they were 33 years ago. Diplomacy still matters as much today as it did then, precisely because it's that human interaction, the connection of one person, one American diplomat, to one person in another society, whether inside government or outside it, that's so important to the defense and the promotion of American interests and values. And I honestly do believe that that's as significant today as it was 33 years ago, or for decades before that as well. We can't take it for granted. We have to invest in our people. We have to do everything we can to protect them. But I think American diplomacy is a crucial instrument for the United States, and it's going to remain that way for a long time to come.